What happens to the world and story of One Piece if Nico Robin didn't survive the Ohara incident? There's no archaeologist on the Straw Hat crew, the world government feels more secure in hiding the true history, and, most importantly, there's no one left alive who can read the Poneglyphs. Or is there? There are two distinct sections of One Piece where Robin's relevance to the story is dramatically different, before and after Zou. As interesting as the Poneglyphs have been for the audience since their introduction, Zou sets the road Poneglyphs up as vital for the endgame of the series. Before this point, on paper, Robin's position on the crew is the least necessary. It's not like Luffy ever set out to sea with the desire for a historian. I'm not even sure he could say the word archeologist. But once the Straw Hats arrive at Zou, Robin becomes arguably the most important person on the crew and on the sea. Before we discuss how the story would shake out after this point, first, we need to go back and see if the Straw Hats would even make it there without the Demon Child on their crew. In a version of reality where Crocodile and Robin never teamed up, you'd have to imagine he'd still go through with his scheme to take over Alabasta, and worry about translating the Poneglyphs after he took possession of the kingdom. The reason we first met Robin off the shores of Whiskey Peak was because she was doing some behind-the-scenes scheming, and had actually laid a lot of groundwork for how this arc unfolds. It's because she allowed Vivi and Igaram to follow her that they even learned Mr. Zero's true identity, which is why Vivi is dying to get back home, and her revealing the truth to the Straw Hats is why they're being hunted by Baroque works to begin with. The basic fact that Vivi doesn't know Mr. Zero is Crocodile changes the entire story. But I think it's fair to assume Vivi could have still figured out Crocodile's identity either another way, or by following the replacement Miss All Sunday, who, guessing by this motley crew, would likely not be as hyper-intelligent as Robin. If we continue with this generous reinterpretation of events, not much changes in the Alabasta arc until Luffy is stabbed by Crocodile. Robin pulls him out of the sand, but given Pell is fast behind her, it's reasonable to assume he could have rescued Luffy as well. And that's really it, as far as Robin being replaced by another Miss All Sunday. Maybe that new lady joins the fight somehow, but the general structure and outcome could remain practically the same. Surprisingly, I don't think it's that cut and dry with Skypiea. There are a couple of important moves Robin makes, like pointing the crew toward Mont Blanc Cricket and choking the thick monk, not a euphemism, but those could have been resolved in other ways. Her major contribution is setting up the entire endgame of the arc. Although she isn't directly involved in the climactic fight, it's because of her translating the Shandorian text that Eneru becomes obsessed with acquiring the Golden Bell before destroying Skypiea. You might be thinking, does the bell really matter that much? Yes! The ending of Skypiea is one of, if not the only times in the story where the antagonist gets away because kicking his ass isn't Luffy's goal. He wants to ring that bell to let Cricket know Noland wasn't a liar. The only reason Eneru is in the one spot in the sky that's accessible to Luffy is because he wants the bell. So, by removing Robin's conversation with Eneru, the outcome of the arc is called into question. That's why I love doing these little what-if scenarios. Removing key features reveals fun quirks of the story that I never would have thought of on my own. The video could end right here, and I think there's a fair point to make that without Robin, the Odyssey is cut short in the sky. But, for the sake of argument and teasing out this thought experiment a little longer, I think a case could be made that events could have unfolded in a similar way. Eneru is still going to kill everybody, and Luffy would still try to stop him. Eneru could spot the bell while traveling into the sky and decide to grab it. While indulging in his hubris, Luffy could stop him and ring the bell anyway. There wouldn't be the build-up that made the climax so satisfying, and like all of One Piece, the arc would have been worse off without Robin, but I think a similar outcome is within the realm of the reasonable. Let's move on in the timeline where everyone doesn't die from being barbecued by lightning or pancaked by an incredible fall. Nothing about the Davy Back fight would be changed. It's Aokiji's encounter with the Straw Hats that vanishes. It's safe to assume he was on Long Ring, Long Land for her. So the Straw Hats wouldn't run into Aokiji at this point, which could actually have some ripple effects with 2nd and 3rd gear, since this major ass-kicking inspired Luffy, but generally, they'd simply continue on to Water 7, where things would be different, although not as much as you might think. When I think of the Water 7 saga, the first thing that pops into my mind is Robin. But there is a ton going on, and most of it doesn't actually rely on her presence. Let me explain. Robin's relevance to the plot doesn't pop up until well into the arc. Everything with Usopp's fight, the news about Mary, and the conflict with the Frankie family is completely divorced from her existence. It's only when Iceberg being shot hits the papers that the Straw Hats get involved in her storyline. CP9 wanted to pin the attempted assassination on them to set the stage for stealing the blueprints for Pluton. Take out Robin, and CP9 could still do something similar. Dress a certain way, or leave behind some kind of clue that ties the assassination attempt to the Straw Hats. Robin wasn't their goal. She was a fugitive they happened upon and used for their own ends. That's why CP9 immediately goes to take Frankie back to Eni's lobby. In fact, since Sanji wouldn't be acting all mysterious and cool in his search for Robin, he'd never catch the sea train in time, which means Usopp would take Robin's position as CP9's second prisoner on the Judicial Island. So all of Eni's lobby could play out similar enough, with the Straw Hats going to rescue Frankie and Usopp. If Iceberg asked Luffy to help Frankie, I think he'd honor that request, and the same alliance would be formed. Unfortunately, Usopp being captured means he'd never be able to call his friend, the hero from Sniper Island's Soga King, for help. But his capture seals the deal that the Straw Hats would still get involved. Now, does this sound way worse than the true Water 7 saga we got? Absolutely, and I think it would ruin Usopp's character, but structurally, I don't think removing Robin from this saga changes much about how things proceed, which is kind of shocking. Thriller Bark, the entire Summit War and Fishman Island sagas, and Punk Hazard are much the same. Robin does have a couple of combat feats which would make her absence somewhat impactful, but not critical to how the broad strokes of the story play out. The most story impact Robin has through these arcs is at the very end of Fishman Island, while discussing Shirahoshi being an ancient weapon with King Neptune, which Caribou overhears. At the time of writing this, it's unclear what Caribou will do with this information, but without Robin's presence, the possibility for him to do anything doesn't even exist. And that takes us to Dressrosa, the final arc before Zoe, and one of the most reliant on Robin's presence. There's a ton that Robin is heavily involved with. The initial meeting with the Tontada, her partnership with Usopp during Operation SOP, her connection with the revolutionaries, and her fight against the Don Quixote family and protection of Rebecca, so Kyros can focus on taking down Diamante. And I think that's the most impactful role that she plays. I don't know if Kyros and Rebecca would have gotten out of things unscathed without Robin around. But at the same time, I don't think that has enough of an impact on the larger story to really change much. It's hard to say definitively that Robin's absence would have resulted in Luffy not defeating Doflamingo, and at the end of the day, that's what success in this arc called for. With that said, I think it's reasonable that the Straw Hats do make it to Zoe without Robin, but everything changes from here. In this Robinless reality, the most interaction that the Straw Hats would have had with the Poneglyphs would have been at Alabasta, and it's unclear that they'd ever even learn that part of Crocodile's plan. Actually, I'd be surprised if in the real story, half of the Straw Hats even know about that now. So, when the crew gets the scoop about the road Poneglyphs, I'm sure they'd be hella confused. But it wouldn't be an incomprehensible concept. It's really just a treasure hunt to put a map together for the final island. Once that's explained, the Straw Hats would understand the need for all 4 road Poneglyphs. That's not the problem. The problem, and it's a big one, is that no one in the entire world can read them. In the actual story, it's easy for the Straw Hats to just say, we'll make copies of the Poneglyphs for Robin to translate. But what the hell do they do without her? Half the reason Big Mom and Kaido are just sitting on their asses is because they have no way to find Laugh Tale. would the Straw Hats end up in the same position, just collecting illegible texts and waiting for a miracle? The way I see it, there are some reasonable paths the crew could go down if they're given some heavy exposition, but keep in mind, they still have to deal with Sanji's Whole Cake Island situation and the alliance against Kaido. Now, the crew could just say, fuck it, we have too much going on, we'll deal with this later, but I think that's a bit too foolish even for Luffy, especially considering Law would be hearing this information too. So let's assume the crew asks for as much info as possible. During Zou, the crew is told that Momo's ancestors could read the Poneglyphs, although the chain was broken with Odin. So, with this information and a couple of options, what's the game plan? For Luffy, getting Sanji back is still the priority. After all, he can't be king of the pirates without him. Since the Straw Hats' first and only solid lead came from Momo, I think they'd put their faith in finding someone from Wano to help them, after they defeat Kaido. So, the goals would still remain the same as in the original story, but with an addendum. Save Sanji, reunite at Wano, defeat Kaido, then find a rock reader. Can they pull it all off without Robin, or will their plan backfire? Luckily enough for me, Robin isn't involved in Whole Cake Island at all, which makes my job a lot easier. Nothing about Brook making a copy of Big Mom's road poneglyph would need to change, but I think now is as good a time as any to point out that the road poneglyphs aren't the only ones that will matter in the endgame. Throughout the story, Robin was collecting translations from the other kinds of poneglyphs with the goal of uncovering the true history. That has yet to come into play, but needless to say, without Robin's discoveries throughout this journey, the Straw Hats are likely to be completely owned at some point down the line. Next up, Wano. Now, Robin does get some information during her undercover time with Orochi, and she even lays the absolute smackdown on Black Maria, but she's also targeted by Black Maria and CP0 because of her knowledge. None of that motivation for the antagonists would have existed during the raid, so it's hard to say for certain that the raid would have failed without Robin present. What is clear, though, is that Robin's vital position is entirely upended by the end of this arc. Leave now if you don't want any spoilers for what happens after the raid. The anime isn't up to that point yet at the time this video comes out, so you have been warned. Robin is no longer the sole interpreter of the Poneglyphs. There's also Kazuki Sukiyaki. It isn't outright stated that he can read the Poneglyphs, but, as I said, in Zou, it was stated that this was a tradition passed down in the Kazuki line, and we know for a fact Odin could read them. So, he was likely taught by his father. Although in the events of the real story, Sukiyaki only reveals himself to Robin, I think it's highly likely he would have revealed himself to another member of the crew, given everything they just did for his kingdom. Especially since he'd know he was one of, if not the only person in the world, capable of reading the Poneglyphs that the Straw Hats are desperate to have translated. With copies of the Zou, Whole Cake Island, and Wano Poneglyphs, the crew would actually be in the exact same position leaving Wano as they were in the true story, just missing one last road poneglyph to translate. Now, we enter sheer speculation mode. What direction does the story go in now that the Straw Hats know of another poneglyph translator and there's just one left for them to track down? Welp, obviously, I have no idea what's going to happen. I have a hunch the road poneglyph is on Elbaf. That just seems almost a bit too obvious of a vanilla prediction, but how many more islands are we really gonna visit before Laugh Tale? Besides the point. Straight up, I think Luffy asked Sukiyaki to join his crew. They do have a bit of a connection, and now that Wano is secured, he may feel a responsibility to set out to the sea, to take the journey that changed his son's life, and to see where the mystery of the Poneglyphs leads. That could actually be another really interesting mirror of Roger and Luffy's voyages. Anyway, from here on out, the Straw Hats would at least have a translator with them at all times, who could also work as the resident weaponsmith. He'd be able to translate the final road poneglyph, But of course, he wouldn't have the library of knowledge that Robin had collected, both from her days at Ohara and her travels translating the other Poneglyphs. Ultimately, he couldn't really serve as a full-on replacement for Robin, but in the immediate term, he'd likely be able to get the crew to laugh tail. I mean, there's also the possibility that he refuses to leave Wano. Either way, the Straw Hats would still have a secret ace up their sleeve that they could return to with a copy of the Final Road Poneglyph. Hell, if Sukiyaki refused to leave, Yamato staying behind to defend Wano would make even more sense and wouldn't feel as narratively jarring. A win-win! I guess the conclusion I've come to is that despite how truly wonderful I think Robin is, and let me emphasize that she's by far my favorite crew member, the story of One Piece wouldn't entirely fall in on itself without her. I couldn't say that until Wano resolved and Sukiyaki was revealed, but his existence actually gives the story an out in case anything happens to Robin, which actually worries me. Why did Oda do this? Anyway, I guess Robin would be happy that her existence isn't the only thing giving this world hope that one day it might be free. Although, her sticking around certainly makes that far more likely, and the story far more enjoyable. With my spiel done, what do you think? Do you think it's reasonable to say that the Straw Hats could make it through their entire journey without Robin? There are definitely some touchy spots throughout. Is there something else glaringly obvious that I missed that you need to shout at me about? Please let me know that and what you thought of this what if down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and until the next time, I'll shut up.